Very good morning, all our dear listeners and viewers. You are welcome to yet another weekly talk show. Same time, same place, same moderator, but different hosts. This time I have General Gregory Muntu. I'll be introducing him in a short while. I also have Cissy Kagaba. Cissy Kagaba has been on this show before. And my name is Felix Kafuma. We are a couple of hours away from knowing what will happen, whether we are continuing to be given leave through a lockdown, or life will partly return to normal. But before we start, I'm encouraging each one of you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. They are going to flash those details on the screen, our YouTube channel. Subscribe on to our Facebook live and also ACFIM Twitter handle so that you can be part of these discussions. Today, we are discussing a very interesting topic that tries to understand the capture of state institutions and service delivery in Uganda. Yes, and probably before I unpack the topic for discussion, allow me to first introduce. Let me start with a lady, because of my strong belief in the affirmative action. Is this still affirmative action, Cissy, if I may ask?
Well, again, that is relative, and let us not go into that discussion right now, Felix. No, it's good
to Okay, that is Cissy Kagaba. Cissy Kagaba is a lawyer by profession, but works with Anti-Corruption Coalition Uganda. That's a body that is responsible for fighting corruption, and probably I will ask Cissy how far they have gone in winning that war. It seems to be a war that is quite tricky at the moment. He's passionate about anti-corruption related work, and when we discuss service delivery and we discuss capture of state institutions, you very well know that that fits within the discussion of corruption, because you cannot eliminate corruption from the capture of state institutions and service delivery. So, Cissy, you're most welcome to today's Virtue Forum talk show.
Thank you, Felix, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, and then my other panelist is a person that is well known to you, is no stranger in such spaces. Quite a rich CV, but I'll try to be humble about it and pick out the main nuggets. General is a freedom fighter, so he's part of the team that ushered us into the current leadership we have right now, although along the way he parted ways. He's, I think, the longest serving army commander. He's a politician. He has been in parliament. I think also he has served in IALA, the East African Legislative Assembly, for 2 terms. He has founded a number of political parties. He is among the founders of FDC, but also moved on, and he's now he's also a founder, one of the founder members of Alliance for National Transformation, and is also their national coordinator at the moment. So I think we have the right person to discuss a topic concerning the capture of state institutions. One, because he has served in a number of institutions. He has been part of this government at some point, and he's also partly active in politics of Uganda by running a political party. General, you are most welcome to this talk show.
Thank you, Felix, and hosting me on this platform. It's my first time. It's my pleasure to be able to share my thoughts on the topic on this platform today.
The pleasure is mine.
One correction to make maybe in the course of your introductions. The longest commander of the army we've had so far is General Aronda.
He has more years than you served?
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, thank you for that correction. Thank you so much, General. In fact, now let me start with you before I come to Cissy. Probably let me help the viewers out there to understand how did we arrive to this topic. Last week, the current premier, Right Honorable Robin Anabanja, did share with the public that he was being threatened by some individuals. That is following his interruption or intervention when he was in Cissy concerning that procurement of items that were delivered to the people who had been affected by River Nyamwamba that had displaced a number of people in Cissy. And some of the items that had been delivered, like the blankets, mosquito nets, and some of the food relief items were not of standard. So he was very route about it and ordered that they be taken back and another consignment be delivered. But shortly after that heroic act, he later on shared that he was being threatened. That was expected by some of us who have been following trends on how certain things work in Uganda here. But she was not the first person to come out and allude to a group of individuals who apparently appear to work behind scenes and either connected to the corridors of power and either operate formally or informally to influence and affect the way institutions function. So that brought back the topic of the captivity of state institutions, especially when we discussed them vis-a-vis service delivery in Uganda, because what the premier was doing was to deliver a service. But now here we are. There are people who think that service should be secondary, but self-gain should be primary. So just to let you know that this discussion has been around for some time, including coining the word called mafia infiltration in the way government operates. We've had on many occasions, Tamale Milundi has alluded to a mafia network. The former Vice President, Professor Bukenya, alluded to mafias existing. We had the former ICT Minister and Minister of Lands at some point, Aida Nantaba. The former Speaker also alluded to an existence of mafias. Evelyn Anite at some point, then when he was working as the Investment Minister, also alluded to the same. The city has retained since then, meaning that when it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, definitely it is a duck. So let me get this started. General, in all fairness, let's first look at, when you look at the state institutions that are functioning currently in Uganda, okay, are there those that you can point to and say that they are independent of undue influence and they are effective in executing their mandate?
I think one thing we need to start with is to analyze the government itself. What is the dominant culture? Because the dominant culture is what determines whether those who are willing to do their best that they can to advance the interests of the country, whether they will succeed or not. The dominant culture in the regime is that those who want to use the state positions they hold to advance their own interests before advancing the interests of the country is the dominant culture. So however good any individual is, as far as I'm concerned, nobody is going to succeed in fighting corruption. I even get surprised when you notice people debating whether Nabanja, whether the Prime Minister will succeed or not. She simply won't. Just like many others who may have tried, have not succeeded at this point in time.
So it's a lost war.
Absolutely. I wouldn't even bother really hoping and expecting that anybody is going to succeed, whether it is the Prime Minister, the Vice President, or anybody else for that matter who is in government.
Well, General starts off by giving us the reality check. Let me come to Cissy at this point. I'll come back to General. Cissy, now that the General says there's a dominant culture, we have a new IGG in place now, Inspector General of Government, Betty Kamya. So I think now that institute is fully constituted. I've seen a couple of times advocating for the constituting that institution fully so that it can operate. But the reality check is that the culture that General is painting is that it's difficult to fight corruption within an environment that where institutions are not independent per se. So, do you buy the narrative that it's a lost war?
Thank you very much, Felix. Well, we all know how some of these institutions work, right from the appointing authority. Now, the whole issue of whether some of these institutions are going to be independent is something totally different. Well, I can choose to be positive that maybe we've seen some small gains here and there, but in as far as functionality of these institutions is still a challenge. You talked of the various times that people have come out and talked about mafias. Now we need to ask ourselves, who are they? Where are they? How come no one is touching them? Because when you talk of state capture, this means that you have a group of individuals that are influencing the decisions of the government. Just like we saw in South Africa, the whole Gupta scenario, how people thought that these guys were actually influencing how our government was running its stuff. So in Uganda, it wouldn't be surprising. And I think for me, that's why people come in and talk of mafias. But you see, these are people you're not going to see. I mean, but though I know that people in government probably know who they are, that's why they'll always use the phase, mafias. But so I think for me it is obvious. And the challenge with that, and I think we saw it when the Prime Minister went and she saw the type of quality of commodities that were given. So we need to ask ourselves, who owns some of these companies? If you lift the veil, who is behind, other than the faces that are floated? When you lift the veil, who is behind? Because it's not the very first time. Look at what happened during the period of COVID. People complained about the quality of the masks, and it was rather unfortunate that the minister then, I think the minister just lamented that, well, the quality is poor. Okay, but I mean, what action was taken? Because the people complained about the quality of the food, people complained about the quality of the masks. So who is this that was supplying that could actually not even be brought to account? And again, we have PPDA regulations. So a person submits quality work that is not of good quality, they're supposed to be blacklisted. So when it comes to service delivery, some of these agencies that have been supplying, and you see, you're going to realize that these are the same companies, but some of them keep changing names, keep changing forms. So we need to ask who is behind some of these companies that keep changing forms and names, and they're untouchables, and they continuously give them business. And in the process of giving them business, what does it mean? They're going to do shoddy work. Who is going to hold them accountable? Again, if the institutions have been captured, you're going to find that accountability is going to be very, very difficult to be given by these agencies.
I'm going to come back to you to ask you a golden question on if that is the situation we are in. So then how do you fight corruption within a state where you have powerful individuals that when you double click, you simply can't see their face. But before I come to that, because I think we need to have that honest conversation. General, how did we get to a point? Because at least when you look at Eastern Europe, he has talked about South Africa. When you look at, I know also Kenya, there are pockets of institutional state capture. You can trace the trajectory on how some of those countries arrive to find themselves in a situation whereby they are individuals that have captured the functioning of state institutions. But when this comes to Uganda, because you've been part of this country, you've been part of the group that liberated the country. How did Uganda get to a point where somehow informal lines of authority came through functioning parallel to formal lines of authority with a lot of power, with a lot of influence, with selfish gain? The culture you're talking about, how did Uganda get to this point?
Well, the NRM regime headed by General Museveni survives basically on using two main tools. One, the use of the state security apparatus. Two, the use of money to rent support. I mean, you can see the extent that they use the money to buy people, compromise people. And the longer it has taken the regime to hang on to power, the more expensive it becomes in terms of having to compromise all kinds of interest groups. When it comes to elections, the money that is poured in, and that money comes from a number of individuals. And the people who are involved in grand corruption are the ones who are the source of that kind of money, besides the money which is channeled from the national budget. So it would be a contradiction, even if it would be a conflict in the mind of those who would want to fight corruption who are in the regime, if they still want to hang on to power at any cost, because they would be conflicted. On one side, they need the money. Now, if they need the money, they are going to clamp down on those who are the source of the money. So the only way you can have that turnaround is if anything would happen, if anything miraculous happened and down onto them, that, you know what, this conflict can only be resolved if they choose to do things in a democratic, transparent way. For example, going to an election and expect that if the population doesn't vote for them, then they bow out, they get out. I don't think that is about to happen. And therefore, we are trapped in that situation. So for anybody to think that this regime can be able to fight corruption effectively, that would just be a pipe dream.
Okay, so in other words, fighting corruption is fighting regime survival in your narrative, right?
Absolutely. They are tied. I mean, there's just no. I mean, you can have some agencies fight corruption in regard to the small men and women who have no protection. You will find cows being arrested and things like that. But grand corruption, the big business people, I don't think that you are going to be able to effectively fight those. And if you don't fight those, there is no way you can eliminate the grand corruption that is causing the hemorrhage that we see in the country. So basically, the only way you can effectively fight corruption is all manner of effort that must be exerted on the ousting of this regime, but also to preparing to ensure that even those who get there are going to be prepared to be able to turn around the situation. I don't see any other way out of that. Because basically, the integrity of any structure is dependent on the materials used in putting up that structure. For example, integrity of any building is going to be determined by the kind of materials that you use to build that structure. So if you find that in this case, it's governance, it's not a physical infrastructure. In governance, the character of the people who are involved in key decision-making positions matter. If they are men and women of integrity, then you know that they are going to build the institutions and put in place the systems that are necessary to check corruption effectively. But if the majority of the actors themselves are flawed, there is no way you can fight corruption and succeed. Because there is no institution right now, including the IGG, including the CID, including any other anti-corruption agency. However good those who may head them or those who are within can fight when they cannot go beyond certain limits. For example, to get to those who are involved in grand corruption. Because those who are involved in grand corruption are protected by those who are in key leadership positions. Those who are in key leadership positions cannot let the agencies fight effectively because they want to hang on to power. So there is no way out of that. So the solution is ousting the regime, but to ensuring that those who get in there are different. For anybody who wants to fight corruption, you go anyway.
Interesting. Cissy, let me come to you on this one. So within such a context, which the general is painting, how do you then fight corruption in an environment which the general has just painted? First of all, help us understand, because you've been at it for quite some time. At what point did corruption, the form and nature of corruption, start to change to portray pockets of this capture of institutions to make it more difficult to fight? You help us, because I think you've been tracking corruption, how it has kept changing. Because I know for a fact that in the 90s, the corruption then was different from the corruption in the 2000s.
Okay.
And then also, when you help us track the trajectory, also within that, how do you then fight corruption in such an environment which seems to be, the general is painting that seems to be impossible?
Okay.
What should we do?
I think one, just to go back to the 10-point program that the regime used when they were coming to power. And point number 7 is very clear that their aim was to fight corruption. And of course, over time, you're going to realize that quite a number of institutions have been put in place by the regime. If you look at the constitution, it establishes quite a number of institutions that are supposed to fight corruption. So when you're looking back at the 10-point program and where we are at now and how we reached here, and going back to the question of state capture, you realize that over time, we've seen informal groupings coming up, informal groupings of individuals. And when these come up, you realize that if no action is taken against them, you're going to end up having what you call, or you're going to breed impunity. And as long as you have impunity and you have a group of small people that are very powerful and influential and they are untouchable, then obviously you're not going to expect much. Now, and again, that's why I started from the 10-point program, point number 7, which was very, very clear, fighting corruption. But in the process, you realize that actually corruption is now fighting the regime. I was reading somewhere on Twitter, and this guy was saying that the monster is going to become so big that it's going to end up swallowing the regime. They may actually fail to tame it, because you see, this is something that has been there for some time, and this is something that our president, the president has actually also talked about it, and we know that one of that corruption weeks, he decided to walk. And I mean, we're asking ourselves, is he working against himself? Is he working against the regime? We really don't know. But now that shows you how far we've come, that we've had a lot of talk. Now, instead of talking, we're now walking, we are marching and things like that. But of course, you're going to realize that over time, the forms of corruption, just like in any other country or jurisdiction, the forms of corruption keep on changing. You're going to have cyber crime, that's why you have the we have the Financial Intelligence Authority, which wasn't there before. So you realize that the forms of corruption keep on evolving. And of course, when they evolve, the institutions that have been put in place, do they have sufficient resources, sufficient personnel to ensure that they're able to curb these new forms of corruption? There's a report that has always been produced by the Global Financial, I think it's called Global Financial Integrity Report. When you look at this report, you'll be surprised that we actually lose billions of dollars, by the billions of dollars, not shillings, through illicit financial flows. And now you're going to ask yourself, who are these that are, because illicit financial flows is going to come through money laundering, it's going to come through creation of offshore accounts. So we need to ask ourselves, who are these that are able to siphon monies out of the system and no action is being taken against them? Look at the Auditor General's reports. The Auditor General's reports, bring out quite a number of interesting issues. But who takes action? The entities that are supposed to take action, some of this action is not taken. And I remember there was a very interesting bit that I read when it came to Auditor General's report. And the report was talking about mineral licenses, a company that has failed to pay licenses for minerals. And I was on a particular talk show with one of the former MPs. And that person was saying, yeah, we've seen this, but unfortunately, we can't do anything about it. Now, when you go back to the Auditor General's report, the Auditor General tends to say that I've raised this issue on a number of occasions. So, and that's why I was saying it's important at times to lift the veil to know who is behind some of these companies that are actually not even paying taxes. Even when the Auditor General brings it out in some of their some of their reports. How come no action is continuously taken? So who is behind some of these minerals that we see coming from particular parts who are not paying licenses, and yet the law is already in place? So I think for me, some of those pointers actually show you to just lead you to state capture, and also to make you to understand that, yeah, there are those informal groupings that even when government entities themselves come out, produce these reports, you still realize that some of these issues will not be touched, but other issues will be touched, and some of these will just be swept under the carpet. So I think for me, that is how we got that we have laws in place, we have institutions in place, they do make recommendations, but some of these recommendations are taken on selectively, depending on who they're supposed to touch or who they're supposed to influence.
Wow. Interesting. You introduced something that I'm going to ask the general to. I don't know whether the general will be bold enough, because everyone talks about mafias, but we cannot point at who is the mafia in this case. So are we having a faceless corruption fight? We can't put a finger to who exactly we are fighting against. So we end up fighting against the regime, basically, because you said corruption and the regime are synonymous. But as you answer that question, whether do we have a faceless corruption fight, or I want you to help us because which institutions are captured in this case? Because well, some may say, okay, I can tell you for sure that from the behavior of the legislature, you can say it is captured. Behavior of the judiciary, probably there are pockets of capture. But which are those institutions, in your view, that you feel are captured, and who is capturing them?
You see, the key actor in a country is a president or a prime minister. Countries which are held by prime ministers, in our case, it's a president. If General Museveni was serious in, Cissy talked about when he walked. If he was serious to fight against corruption, then you would notice his seriousness in the manner in which the government would fund the Criminal Investigation Department and IGG. You never understand the seriousness of a regime from what they say. Anytime you want to understand the intention of any government, you look at the budget, where the budgetary requirements are funded most. So if you go in the Criminal Investigation Department and you find that the money they get cannot even fuel the criminal investigation in the districts, forget Kampala first, to move around even for 2 weeks, then forget about the rhetoric. You know that they're just paying lip service. General Museveni going to walk against corruption was deliberate, because he's really so crafty in terms of how he plays out psychological warfare against the mindset of the population. For people to say the man really wants to fight these people, but in this case, I think they also think that the mafia is fighting him. But you see, they are linked. Because for the regime to survive, first, the people who are involved in corruption must know that whatever they do, they're not going to be touched. They are the conduit through which money is sucked from all different areas of the sectors of the economy into the operations of whatever they do to rent support. So that's how impunity grows. So on one side, you have weak institutions that are meant to fight corruption, which are not funded. And they do not have the backup to know that I will walk in any office and conduct an arrest and there will be no reprisals. So when you don't have that environment in which the IGG knows that they can even arrest a minister and they are not funded at the same time, how on earth would anybody expect that anybody, whether they are whether they're involved in the mafia rackets, that they would be curtailed in their operations. And as to the individuals, I normally don't go into individual names because in any case, I know even if you announce names, even if those people for some reason exited this planet and died or anything, that's not the issue because it's not the individuals, it is the culture. It is the environment in which we are operating. Because one can drop dead today, another one will come up. Why? Because the regime still wants to survive. And they have to, the only way they can survive is to keep on looting. So at the end of the day, there is no way you can really think that you can effectively fight the mafia or fight the nature of corruption in this country unless you resolve the political question. Get a new set of Ugandans who would be able to strengthen the institutions, put in place the systems which are necessary to fight, put money where it is meant to be in the agencies that fight corruption. That's the only way you can expect that the Ugandans who are in the different agencies and have got the heart and desire to fight, that they'll be able to fight effectively. Right now, their hands are tied. I think they are just there, in their offices, crying their hearts out. And I don't think they can do anything. The only other way is if NRM was to change this environment, is if something happened to the leaders miraculously and they adopted a new mindset. I don't think they're about to do that. They don't have the will. They're simply incapable because their psychology, their mindset is, enriching themselves. They are driven by self rather than being driven by values or being driven by the desire to develop the country fast. So it's not that that's the reality.
That's the reality.
As far as I'm concerned, yes.
Okay, Cissy, in a culture that the general is painting, because what you're explaining and what the general is explaining is that, okay, and it partially touches that form of corruption, for that form of capture, which is called systemic capture, where basically the systems cease to work for the people and then they work for the individuals. And then you have individuals here that encode advantages around those systems and render them very, very ineffective. So even when you talk about, because earlier on you were talking about the institutions that the president under the NRM leadership has put in place to fight corruption, that even when you put in place institutions, those institutions are already, or the systems per se, they are already captured, not to serve their purpose, but to serve the purpose of those few selfish individuals. Now that is the understanding, and we seem to be having, and because you also partly touched it, and those people who do capture those, who capture systems and drive them away from serving the interest of the public to self-interest. So in that case, how then should the anti-corruption fight be modeled?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Felix, because one, just like the general said, the way the environment is, it makes it rather difficult. But again, I also know that we have pockets of capture, because you talked of the judiciary. Of course, we've heard of what we call cadre judges. Now, and if you're to go back and look at some of the decisions that some of them have made, there's been a lot of public outcry. But I also know that there are those that are within the judiciary that are not necessarily cadre judges, and they have been able to render very good decisions. So what I know is that the state capture always comes in when it comes to particular grand corruption schemes. Usually these petty ones, no. And even grand corruption is going to be selective. Who is it? Because again, when you look at the anti-corruption code, they've been able to dispose of quite some very good cases involving grand corruption. But yet also we know at the same time, there's some cases which were the IG at one point some time back, long ago, they lost interest in the case. So you realize that even in grand corruption, there are pockets. It depends on which side are you on, which side is behind this grand corruption. If it's just no one, well, no quote unquote, no mafias, then obviously the person will be taken on. So I think for me, the pockets of influence when it comes to state capture, those are small pockets of people who are influential, and it will depend on what the case is and what the scenario is. That is when they're going to come in. But if they're not affected by any particular, if these few individuals are not affected by any particular issue, well, they will not really come in. But it depends on where you touch. And if you touch a nerve of a person that is very influential, obviously you won't expect anything much. And I think that is why we hear of the whole issue of syndicated corruption. When you're dealing with syndicates, you don't even know who is within these syndicates. That means along the chain of a syndicate, there's one who is very powerful, which means at the end of it all, nothing much is going to come into play. Of course, the institutions themselves will, some of them may either can give an example of courts of law. I mean, you can choose to adjourn, you continue adjourning, you adjourn the cases, then you go to appeal. When the appeal process comes in, the allocation of files takes years and years, because there's a person who is behind this particular case who doesn't want to see the case being handled, and eventually people end up losing time. But also remember that the more cases are delay, anyone can easily tamper with the evidence. So we need to appreciate the fact that some of these pockets depend, or these pockets of capture are going to they're very smart, and they know which particular areas they're going to target. They won't really target everywhere. That's why at times when you look at them IGG report, you realize that some people have been arrested, some action has been taken, but again, on whose toes are they stepping on? There was a time when the former IG said that there are people who hide the president, who hide behind the president. That is a statement that previous Lady Justice Irene Muliago made. So you realize that even some of their work at times is going to be curtailed when it comes to the type of investigations and who is behind the investigation. But if it is not anyone, if it isn't any of the, well, someone calls them cabal, if they're not any of those, then obviously the cases will be concluded. Because I know when you look at IG's report, there's certain good case, there's certain people who have been arrested, there's certain action that has been taken. But again, for me, my issue is when you're talking of state capture, who are those individuals? Because at times you never get to know who they are, they're just influential, and at times they're in a particular syndicate, and the system also fears to touch them. So yes, we may, at times agencies may say they are independent, and we've had that many times. They say, yeah, we're independent. But the issue is, how independent are they from some of these powerful individuals? Because I can be independent in as far as going for local government officials, going for people that are not influential, but how independent are they when it comes to, touching the nerve where it hurts most? And I think for me, going back to your question, I think it will still go back to the people, because power still belongs to the people, and the people are willing to see change. And I think I like what the General said, that there has to be something done politically, because the environment, the prevailing environment, makes it very difficult, because people will ensure that they cling on to power and do whatever it takes. And again, I like the issue that you raised of the budgeting. If you look at the budgets of some of these entities and look at the State House budget, it shows where priority is right now. Yes, and again, the issue of budgeting, just look at some of these reports. When you look at Auditor General's reports, IG reports, they will tell you that they're financially constrained. At times, they cannot even do some of the work that they're supposed to do. So is their budget deliberately cut to ensure that they don't do or achieve their mandate? So I think for me, again, that is also another bit of a challenge, that because if we're dealing in cyber crime, do we have these entities powerful, strong enough with the equipment to ensure that they're able to follow through each and every crime? Because they may go for one or two small cyber crimes, but they're bigger. And I think from that's why I even talked of illicit financial flows. Who are these people that are removing or illicitly taking monies out of the system? And do we have systems that are strong enough to actually hold them accountable?
Wow. This is interesting. General, let me come to you on this one now. There is a narrative now. There are people who believe that, somehow this group of individuals has grown so powerful, and to the extent that they have captured, including capturing the presidency. I think you've heard about that assertion that it's possible that even the president sometimes finds himself in a situation where he can't do so much. Now, when you have the head of state, it's alleged that the head of state he finds himself in a situation where he is captured by these powerful individuals that to keep him in power, first of all, they must steal, they must maintain the status quo, and they must finance. It is in their interest to keep him in power, and he can't do much even when sometimes he feels that this is getting too much. How far true is this that also the presidency is captured? Because partly we've been touching institutions that have been captured, and we know for sure from a number of case studies that Parliament, the way it functions of late, it's difficult to say it is not a captured entity. So is the judiciary, and literature also presupposes that in most cases the institutions that are of interest to be captured are usually the legislature, the judiciary, regulatory institutions, but also when it gets to the extreme, also the executive can be captured. Is that where Uganda is, or that's a far-fetched analogy?
I mean, we're in a state of, at least in regard to the fight against corruption, the regime itself is trapped. General 7 is trapped between a rock and a hard place. Even in a situation when maybe he would want to fight against corruption, he simply can't because he wants to hang on to power. There's no way he's going to hang on to power unless he continues using all kinds of channels that they use to amass money to keep renting the support and compromising people using money. So in that situation, therefore, he's simply incapable of fighting corruption, as I've already indicated. The only institutions where one would have had the hope that they can help the country break out of this vicious cycle would have been the parliament. Because the members of parliament, if we had a critical number of members of parliament who are bold, but also who are broad in thinking, who look at the country and put the country before self, then we could have had a political resolution through parliament by standing firm and pushing for reforms, and also pushing for example, those reports they're talking about of the IGG and all that, to a point where if they were bold members of parliament, including those who would be in the NRM, to a point where now the presidency would recognize that if they do not make compromises, that even their own power base is gone. But unfortunately, I think two things which are a bit of a problem in regard to the members of parliament. One, many of them operate from a mindset of survival as individuals. I don't think they are looking at the country. Two, for different reasons, they are fearful. They are not bold enough. So in that regard, parliament has become an institution that cannot effectively act as a counterbalance against the executive and therefore effectively fight against corruption.
Are in those conditions you are raising, General, are in those conditions you are raising the issue of mindset for survival and also the fact that they are fearful, are in those conditions that have been put in place by those that have captured the institution? Because if you are to make it, if you are to render this institution, I don't want to use the word useless, but weak, of course, you have to put it into a situation whereby it's an institution that is more or less having legislators who are preoccupied
of course,
business.
It's been deliberate. It's been done in a very systematic way, to a point where the majority of the leaders in parliament, in cabinet, and elsewhere have been brought to that point. But see, the point is that it's a country. We are all citizens of a country of 45 million people. So one would have expected that the leaders who at a different level would know that if they don't stand and do the things which are necessary to be done for the country to progress, that we all become victims eventually. Therefore, whatever measures the regime would be using, General Museveni is very crafty in terms of using all kinds of skillful methods to compromise people. Some using money, others fear, others dangling positions. But one would have hoped that with an educated population as we have now, that the leaders who end up in positions of responsibility would have the capability to know that, you know what, this country doesn't belong to any one individual, that this country belongs to 45 million Ugandans. And therefore, they, as representatives, must ensure that they do things which are necessary to advance the interests of the country. Now, unfortunately, we don't have them yet. And therefore, anybody who wants to fight corruption effectively, that's the focus that we have to put our eyes onto. How do you build a critical number of Ugandans who are ready to step in and also fight, who want also backward? Because the money is, don't think that all those people who've been compromised at some point when talking about the fight against corruption. But the allure of money is also strong. So you also need leaders at different levels, and in a significant number of them, who are psychologically prepared, who are able to think in broad terms, to know that the advancement of the country is what would enable them to benefit as individuals, not to advance as individuals and therefore think that the country would follow in their footsteps. That's simply a warped way of looking at things. So there has to be a critical number of leaders in that regard. The regime now, for them to think that they can fight corruption is a lost cause. I even get surprised when people like the Prime Minister, if she's someone who wants to fight corruption, I would be surprised for her to think that she would effectively do so. She just simply can't. You know, she has got to learn to live with the situation. She may be able to tackle some people and take them out, the small fry, but she must live with the reality that there are many, many people whom she won't be able to touch. She should know that. Two, at least she has been able to recognize that there's a mafia. But by now she should have known, even by the time she became a prime minister, that there was a mafia in the government. You know, I think she's not the first prime minister. The first one who cried out loud was, I think, a vice president at that point. It was Gilbert Okeny, I suppose. Yes. And then another one who cried out of mafia, I don't know whether Right Honorable Prime Minister Mbabazi cried out about mafia.
Yes, he also did. Yes.
The Speaker of Parliament, the one who left, was crying about mafia. Yes. So I suppose that by the time the current Prime Minister stepped in, should have known the environment in which she was going to operate. So she shouldn't be surprised. No Ugandan should be surprised. And therefore, we should know that the problem really is the regime itself. The solution is a political solution. Anybody who doesn't understand that has a problem, I believe.
Okay, interesting. Cissy, let me come to you and briefly take you a little bit back, because there is a study I was looking at, and they were trying to trace the issue of the capture of state institutions. How does it take root in Uganda, to see what we are seeing today? And many of them point to the phase where Uganda privatized, and around that time we see a number of previously public institutions or enterprises being sold to individuals who at that point amassed wealth, and with wealth came power and influence. Fast forward in the early 2000s, we then also see Uganda starting to enter into what we call a multi-party dispensation, where now politics became too competitive. Before, there was we were under the one-party state rule, the movement. So in transition from a one-party state to multi-party dispensation, stakes became higher. So we start to see the politics of commerce come into play, when the politics of commerce comes into play, we start to see interests at play where, in this case, politicians, vis-a-vis politicians and businessmen want to access or be closer to corridors of power for self-gain. Is it right for us to assert that in actual sense, the transition from a one-party state to multi-party dispensation, and I'll come to general when we talk about the political party capture, because there's also that problem, to multi-party dispensation, is that's when we start to see, first of all, the stakes are higher for the regime, which keeps talking about, to now consider using money to keep in power. And to use money to keep in power is to give corruption room to thrive.
Thank you, Felix. I think again, when you talk of state capture, I'm still sure that even then it was there, but probably at small levels. Just like we knew corruption was there before, but has continuously been increasing. So whether we changed from one-party state to having quite a bring on board other political parties, I don't really think that would have made any difference, because the group we are talking about, or those that have captured the state, do not necessarily belong to the opposition. Yes, of course, I know that there's a lot of use of monies within the entire process, but again, we know that few opposition leaders are going to be that influential to capture the state, to ensure that their decisions are going to impact, or their decisions are going to change what a particular person, what a particular group wants to do. So I think for me, it goes back to it. I think for me, it has been a gradual process. Some of these small groups of people have been, they've been changing faces, but I think for me, it has been gradual to where we are right now, where the levels are actually higher. But though I still think back then, yes, it was still there, but not as common or not as rampant as we see it now. Because if you go backwards again and look at the times when you've seen prime ministers, the speakers, all these people coming out and making noise, claiming about the whole issue of mafias, it has been of something that has been...
Even the president has made noise about it. No, he called them Kawukumi bin weavers. Probably used another term, but he was referring to some quote-unquote mafia-like kind of...
that's psychological warfare. It's just playing games. Yes.
Yeah, but that is what becomes... Yes, please.
Yeah, but let me first bring in General here, because there's a point you're raising. General, the issue of multi-party politics, because there's a narrative that somehow when states are transiting from a one-party state to a multi-party dispensation, first of all, that transition presents weak. The infrastructure is usually weak. What I mean is that political parties are still weak. So was the case in Uganda. You find that along the way, opportunistic individuals take advantage of the weaknesses in the transitions, but also the stakes become higher. In this case, it was for the first time when we transited to party politics, there was now official stiff competition for the regime in power to stay in power. That meant that somehow money had to take its place in determining outcomes. For that money to play its role very well, you have to make somehow you relax some of the conditions you had on how you tackle corruption and allow some of the regime apologists to engage, quote unquote, in corruption to finance the political ambitions of the party to stay in power. Does that narrative in any way, are you familiar with it? Because at that point in time, you were part of the regime, then you crossed into the opposition, you were part of that transition. Can you be able to track and say, I think that's where we started to see the capture of state institutions really take root?
I don't buy into that narrative. Okay. Because if we had free, fair, open, transparent competition, and therefore you could say that the regime has been using money to win. But you see, we've never had any free, fair, and transparent election, ever. So you always have the state security apparatus being used, the compromising of the Electoral Commission. So if a regime wanted to use those tactics, but also fight corruption, it could have done that. But any system, whether it is multi-party, whether it is an autocratic regime, is as good as the people who run it. If you have men and women whose cardinal motive is to fight against corruption, regardless of whether they are in a multi-party dispensation or even running a benevolent dictatorship, they'll be able to route it out. I mean, we see like Singapore. When Singapore started, it is maybe the closest example we can read from. It was never a democracy at the initial stages, but they had certain objectives, and they had a team of leaders who ensured that they would fulfill those objectives. One of the objectives was building the state institutions, putting functioning systems, ruthlessly fighting corruption, making that smaller island a base for trade, for light manufacturing, for tourism, and develop their country. And they have effectively done it, and eventually they have evolved into a multi-party dispensation. So they had the desire. They also had the material to use in terms of the men and women who are ready to do that. Because eventually the outcomes of any effort must be dependent on the character, the number of people, their character, their objectives. And if they are able to withstand the challenges they meet on the way and continue until they achieve those objectives. We have got a country like South Korea. The former president, is it a president or prime minister of South Korea, a lady, I don't remember the name, was tried in their court systems, and she was sentenced to prison. South Korea is a democracy now. That's not something that you would see in quite a number of African countries, to have an open process through which a former leader is tried and found guilty and sentenced through court processes. So at the end of the day, what matters is those who occupy positions of power. Who are they? What are they made of? What is the driving motive? If the driving motive is self-aggrandizement, self-enrichment, whether they are running a quasi-multi-party system, whether they are running an autocratic state, they simply cannot advance the interests of the country. They just simply can't, because it's not in them. And all leaders give what they have. If they want to advance themselves, as of necessity, they will be corrupt. So at times I wonder why people get so frustrated. As the Bible says, you reap what you sow. So if you go and sow in terms of advancing the leaders from different areas who go into different positions, if they are corrupt, and then you start crying when they start looting you, why would you cry? Know that that's the seed you planted. Therefore, know that you're going to reap the bitter fruit therefrom. And therefore, if it's a population that is able to learn, then know that, okay, we are now going to uproot these plants which are giving us bitter fruit and plant plants which are going to give us sweet fruit. And therefore, they start looking for men and women, different levels, who have integrity, who are not driven by self, who look at the country and put the country before self, and then they get the solutions in terms of the objectives that they will be able to fulfill in advancing the national interest.
Wow, our time is fast spent. I think I have remaining with almost just 1 minute for just I think one question. I hope Cissy can come back so that she can give her closing remarks. But general, as we come to an end to this discussion, interesting discussion, I want the electoral process is the only process, or elections is the only process through which Ugandans can be able to be guaranteed having the leaders they deserve. I understand with all its imperfections, it's still the logical window we have to have leaders, one that we hold accountable, that will come back after 5 years to account to us and see whether we can take them back or not. But also we choose or decide which leaders can ably serve our interests. I know now the roles of parliament have a bit been skewed over time, but can we still, even with the imperfections of the electoral system, rely on the electoral system or process to address the problem of corruption in Uganda? If we cannot achieve it at the highest level, can we achieve it in the lower? Because we are running a decentralized system. Can we achieve it probably at the parliamentary level or local government level, so that at least we have a say and control over who we send to serve and ensure that we have service delivery? Is that still a viable window?
Well, I don't think we can have any significant forward movement with the current actors. They are just simply compromised. There has to be new actors. So anybody who wants to see a new environment in which transparency can be exercised, in which there is fair play, in which systems function, in which institutions can be regrown, reestablished, then the character of the men and women who act in the politics must be different. Therefore, that's where people must focus. Everybody is focusing about the regime. The regime just won't change anything. And we can either lose the time now and also lose the future, where we're heading. That's another thing which kind of confuses me. You know, because we've been in this vicious cycle over and over. Because the integrity of any system is dependent on the materials that are used to build that system. But if you concentrate on bring down that system without preparing the materials which are better, it means you will bring down the infrastructure and also use the same materials and literally do the same thing. You see it all over the continent, over and over. And as was it Einstein who said, doing the same thing the same way, over and over.
The same way, over and over.
And maybe we are insane.
Wow, Cissy, I'm glad you're back. You are just right in time for the conclusive remarks, but also a question here for you, which is more of moving forward, because now I want you to help us understand, are we dealing with a moral question here, that the legal framework and all the institutions cannot rein in on this problem as we conclude this discussion?
Thank you, Felix. I think for me, one, the legal and the moral fabric have to go hand in hand, because you cannot implement the laws without the moral fabric. But I think the laws, for me, the way they are sufficient. The only challenge that you're going to continuously have is the level of enforcement or implementation, because you've also realized that at times the laws are enforced or implemented selectively. So if that still happens, then it's going to be a bit of a challenge. But again, also going back to strengthening some of these institutions, because the institutions that are supposed to enforce these laws should actually be well facilitated in order for them to do their work. But the other issue, again, it goes back to the point of authority, who appoint some of these individuals. And if they've been appointed by the president, are they going to be able to do their work independently? You see, the constitution saying that institutions are independent is different from the actual practicability of it. Do we see, and that's why you realize people end up coming up with the phrase cadre judges. People tend to think that they're not really that, they're not going to really be that partial when it comes to particular issues involving the regime. But I think for me, the laws are clear, and what needs to be done is to ensure that the laws are enforced. But again, you have another force that is fighting against the enforcement or implementation of some of these laws to their advantage.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you so much. That was Cissy Kagaba, the Executive Director of Anti-Corruption Coalition. General, what are your parting shots as we come to the close of this discussion?
I would like to thank you for hosting me. And really, at the end of the day, nothing is going to happen that is positive in our country coming from anywhere else other than from ourselves. And therefore, the people who really want to see a better country, first, don't give up hope. The situation may seem to be so hopeless, but I believe that there are many Ugandans really who want to see a better country. So concentrate on doing whatever you have to do. Organize yourselves in whatever groups you're able to organize yourselves, and be able to prepare for putting this country back on track. First, of course, exerting all the necessary pressure to ensure that this the exit of the regime is hastened. But not only stop there, because I think that's what frightens me most. Many people bring down the current infrastructure, which is understandable from the human standpoint. You feel aggrieved, you feel pain because of the pressure it is exerted upon you at that point in time. But we've been in this over and over, So as we exert pressure on the current situation, we must be preparing for what happens next. Because the materials, as I indicated earlier on, the integrity of any structure is dependent on the materials that are used to put in place that infrastructure. So the nature of any government, if we are going to have any government that is going to act in a responsible way, in a transparent way, in a just way, in a fair way, the people who are composed therein, there must be a critical number of men and women who have got the capability to be able to do that. That doesn't happen overnight. It takes organization. It takes preparation. Nothing is going to happen. Nothing good is going to happen by accident. May God bless you all.
Thank you so much. That was General Muntu, who is currently the National Coordinator of Alliance for National Transformation and one of the founder members, and also formerly was with FDC. And it's been good to have you on this show. We've been discussing the capture of state institutions and looking at service delivery as the overall big picture. It's been good to have you on the set. Thank you, General, for being part of the discussions. Thank you, Cissy Kagaba, for being part of the discussions. You wanted to say something?
Just wanted to say thank you for hosting me.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. And this has been Felix Kafuma, who's been hosting this talk show for the last 1 hour. We've been discussing basically how do we fight the capture of state institutions and improve service delivery in Uganda. I wish you a wonderful week ahead. Continue practicing the SOPs, and God bless. See you next week. Bye-bye.
The monster of money politics is eating up Uganda's democracy. When you take money from a candidate, it means you are feeding the monster. Then you become a part of the problem. When a candidate who overspends on campaigns is elected, he or she will not represent voters but himself. He or she will engage in corruption to recover campaign money. Social services will not be delivered and the voter will suffer more. Voter, let's be wise. Give democracy a chance. Do not sell your vote. Focus on the issue.